Welcome to this debrief of the Level 4 AAT Audit and Assurance exam. Now, the Chief Examiner's report came out from 2025 and it gives some good insights. It does tell us a lot of stuff that we should already know. Maybe if you failed or you're someone who's done this exam before, okay, a few times, and you're kind of struggling along, or if you're someone that's proactive and actually is looking at this before they do an exam, then well done to you. So either way, we're going to go through some of my highlights of this exam. Okay. Typical typical of what we see in this exam is struggles on the written part. Now, a lot of people are doing this who either haven't got any audit experience or have just kind of started in audit, wouldn't have seen an end-to-end audit, maybe involved in some of the testing, if that. So it becomes a little bit difficult to kind of do the written elements of this, or understand some of the practicalities behind things like materiality. So one of the things we can see first is that the multiple choice areas are typically the best scoring anyway. Most of it is multiple choice, but there are some kind of core written parts. So the conceptual framework, corporate governance, ethics in particular, internal audit is a bit more iffy, but in particular, all those areas are generally okay. They're pretty good and they're well answered, okay, because they're potentially things they've covered in other modules at level 3 or level 2. The big struggle is over here. That written part where we're doing writing audit procedures, that can be a shamble. Okay. Generally, if you're writing them with the right structure, you're on the right lines, but they need to be actually relevant for whatever you're talking about. So you've got multiple hurdles to get through with getting these tests. But it's not something that I see just at level 4. It's something that I see throughout level 7, whether you're doing the ACA, ACCA, and all the others. Okay. So it's not just this level. Okay. But it doesn't make it hard. Timing is not usually a problem, as we can see here. Use about 80% of the time. It's a bit closer to the kind of full time than we see with some other exams, but again, nothing to get too worried about. So key thing is tests that are relevant. Okay. So tests that are relevant, but also tests that deal with that written part. Okay. Absolutely. Cool. And then structuring answers to human mark parts, whatever that is, part of that will be the structure of audit tests, but also any other written parts in the exam. You've got to have a really good structure for things. Okay. Whether it's internal controls, audit risks, or procedures, which are the kind of core areas of written areas. As we move through task 1, okay, task 1, it said it's really well, really high performing. What we typically see with task 1 is that people understand the different levels of assurance. Okay, so reasonable assurance comes from an external audit, limited assurance comes from pretty much everything else. And they understand corporate governance a little bit, but some bits of it, okay, so whether it's separation of different people, understanding the audit committee, all those things can be a bit less well understood, as well as the objective of an internal audit, sometimes against an internal audit. Sorry, objectives of an external audit, but sometimes against an internal audit. They don't really understand the difference between them. Okay, understanding the fact that it's about financial reporting. There are some additional UK specific requirements for this as well for reporting. Understanding it's not about guaranteeing, all those kind of things. As we move to task 2, again, generally well performing, knowing your different ethical threats, knowing your different fundamental principles. You've tested on them so many times, but there is quite a specific context that happens here, particularly with the threats. We see a lot more like specific rules around this. So, you've got specific fees that you might not be able to take on, contingent fees, all those things where it's specific to the nature of audit. Okay. So people are good at objectivity, good at confidentiality, because we worry that the information we're coming across as auditors, that might be things like payroll data, which is very sensitive. But in particular, trying to pick out a safeguard that's relevant. So safeguards are the actions you take to reduce those ethical threats. So sometimes it might be resigning from a piece of work. It might be declining a piece of work. So understanding the nature of that is quite difficult, because a lot of time we might go, oh, I need to resign, and that's the only action. Or you've got to think about, what's the first thing I would do? What is actually appropriate in this scenario? Okay. And then also thinking about how they're applied to different scenarios. So it might just be, as I said, you're picking ones that are pretty irrelevant, okay, or don't address the issue. Okay, so getting another audit partner to do a review on a piece of audit work or non-audit work is still bringing the audit team into that scenario. Okay. Task 3 is where things get a bit more ish. We see a few more issues. Okay, particularly core part of this is risk, and another core part of it is materiality. And we do start to plan what tests we're going to do, and hence you can also be tested on procedures in this. But audit risk is the big bit, right? It's the really big bit that we're looking at, okay, over here when we're talking about this task, because audit risk is the thing we really gets tested so often. Okay, so you need to think about what are the specific risks that we're seeing in this scenario. Okay, so is it something to do with some kind of financial accounting they may get wrong? Is it something to do with maybe they're a new audit client? Okay, those are the really big bits we care about, but mostly it's about financial reporting. Okay, what could the client have done wrong? So could they have treated something as where the cost is actually higher than the NRV now? Okay, that's what we mean by some kind of audit risk. Materiality is also really important. So knowing your thresholds, knowing how it applies. So for example, knowing that as materiality goes down, the risk clearly has gone up, okay, because they're inversely related. Okay, and then where we start to see some good stuff is, which is quite practical actually, understanding what working papers are. Now, if you haven't seen a set of working papers because you don't work in a firm or a practice, then just search on Google. You can find something that's fairly close to it, okay? But you won't find actual working papers released, hence confidentiality. You also thinking about internal controls. Again, this is a really core area of our planning, but particularly when we start getting to the interim testing later. But explaining audit risk. So yes, there's a risk that the NRV might be lower than the cost now, but like, how have you got to that? Okay. And what's the impact of that? So the fact that inventory will be overstated, for example. And then I'm going to say when we get to audit procedures themselves, think of something that's actually realistic. So remember, we're in planning, we're deciding what we're going to do later, but we're thinking about what procedure might actually address this problem. Okay. So what test would actually address this specific problem. Okay, so the audit risk overall is generally done better, which means this overall score on task 3 goes up, but the procedures will bring it back down. Okay, so that's why it's not the highest scoring area. Okay. As we move on to task 4, this is where we're like procedures. This is why it goes very much downhill. It is really tricky to get your head around these, especially if you're not an auditor. Okay. So I'll do plenty of videos and stuff on how to write audit tests, and we'll cover any specific questions. But as I said, as always, just drop me any messages in those comments. So understand the role of an internal auditor, which is, to be fair, I'm always impressed when people get the difference between them, as an ex-internal auditor as well myself, and extracting the deficiencies. Really easy when they say, I don't do this thing. So it's like, okay, I can pick that out and copy it into my scenario, but then explaining what's the impact, like what's the increase in risk that happens because they don't do something. So that's what we're really looking for, is what is a cause for concern. Okay, and when we talk about controls, we generally mean the processes of the business. Okay, so the doors with locks. Okay, that's the control. We do generally care in this exam about things that would affect the financial reporting, but in real life, it's about what are the controls that could lead to something going wrong in the business. Okay, so recommendations, again, appropriate recommendations. Having eye retina scanners for controls is probably not going to be the best cost beneficial control, and testing everything as a business. But remember, the controls are from the perspective of the business, not the auditor. And that's why generally people like picking those out, but struggle with the recommendations. And again, this is really common, that trying to understand the difference between a control and substantive test. Remember, controls is about processes. Substantive test is about testing specific numbers in the financial statements. Okay. Task 5, also pretty good. So understanding the tools. Okay, so whether it's test data, dummy data, all that kind of stuff from an audit perspective, again, it's pretty good. How analyticals will help. and also the objective. So what is the aim of the test? Okay. But when you get to that, the assertion itself is a bit more poor. So trying to understand whether something's testing it's complete or accurate and all that kind of stuff. That is again a tricky thing. Remember, that assertion is telling me why I am testing it. So again, that can be pretty tricky when you sometimes feel like it might test multiple things and everything feels like it tests accuracy, but really it's not. Okay. Or at least not is the primary thing. And then also failing to understand when test controls or substantive should be used, or you don't do test controls. So test controls you wouldn't do if you already knew they didn't have a control. Or why would you then? How would you then test that if it doesn't exist? So again, sometimes it feels a bit more obvious, but I said it's not always as simple as that in the exam. And then finally, reporting, which very few people would have come across unless they're kind of more experienced as an auditor. Okay, you wouldn't see the end result, but you need to know your opinions. Okay, so knowing whether something's material, which decides if it affects the opinion, and then is it something that actually is also pervasive? And if so, you need to decide between is it caused by an evidence problem where we can't see it, it doesn't exist, or is it caused by something we just think actually they're wrong? Okay, and that changes the nature of our opinion. So hence, people can pick stuff out from the scenarios, which are control issues, again, like we had with the earlier task. They can also think about what the impact really is of uncorrected misstatements. So if you're told something is incorrect, then they know kind of how to deal with that. But the actual opinion itself, this causes issues throughout all of my teaching, and I probably will forever cause issues. Okay, people assume it's always an emphasis of matter, which it's actually quite rare it is. Okay, there's only specific circumstances where emphasis of matter comes in, but it sounds like the wording we would use to emphasize something. And then also people identifying consequences of the control deficiencies, which is just explaining the deficiencies. So the first part of telling them and finding the control deficiency is always good, but actually trying to say, and therefore this increases the risk of, or this is the impact of that. That's the more difficult explanation. Okay, and that's the written side of things. Now, I said the pass rate for this is generally pretty positive. Okay, it's something where you can, if you're going to progress onto a higher level qualification, it can be very useful to get more exemptions. Okay, so it's a good one to tackle, and it gets you some really good experience. Okay. Now, hopefully this helps. If you've got any more questions, you'd like any more videos on anything else, just drop me a message in the comments. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed it.